Tyrants care nothing for discussions. Lysander Spooner understood something most Americans still refuse to believe. All those checks on federal power you were taught about, they don't work. Oaths? Meaningless. Elections? Theater. Separation of powers? Not in practice. As Spooner explained, these are all mere words to tyrants, and they do not care what you say. As he put it, discussions which do not interfere with the enforcement of their laws are but idle wind to them. So on this episode, it's Lysander Spooner's red pill about checks on federal power. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, October 31st, 2025. And let's kick it off with the essential foundation. Who decides when government has broken the rules, when government goes beyond the limits of the Constitution? As Spooner explained, if government makes this decision, if government gets the final say over itself, this is the very definition of despotism. He said any government that is its own judge of and determines authoritatively for the people what are its own powers over the people is an absolute government, of course. It has all the powers that it chooses to exercise. There is no other, or at least no more accurate definition of a despotism than this. And then on the flip side, the other end of the spectrum, when the people have the final say, well, that's freedom. He said, on the other hand, any people that judge of and determine authoritatively for the government what are their own liberties against the government, of course, retain all the liberties they wish to enjoy. So they have ownership of themselves. They get to determine what is freedom. He said, and this is freedom. At least it is freedom to them, because although it may be theoretically imperfect, it nevertheless corresponds to their highest notions of freedom. But here's what most people forget to start out. Government is supposed to be merely an agent, not a master. It's supposed to be staff, not the boss. And Spooner said the government and all the departments of the government are merely the servants and agents of the people, not invested with arbitrary or absolute authority to bind the people. And agents and servants, well, and staff, they're given instructions, tasks, lists of stuff that they're supposed to be doing, rules that they're supposed to follow. And in the American system, that's spelled out in the Constitution. But here's the deal. Words on paper don't enforce themselves. They never did, and they never will. As James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said in Federalist 48, a mere parchment barrier is what he referred to the American constitutions, even when he was advocating for ratification. Parchment can't stop power. And that's what Spooner had to say as well. For when did a parchment ever have power adequately to restrain a government that had either cunning to evade its requirements or strength to overcome those who attempted its defense? And this brings us right back to the core problem. When government judges itself, other than a few outlined situations, well, government's just going to determine that everything is constitutional. Whatever it decides it wants to do. And that's how Spooner described it as well. For everything a government pleases to do will, of course, be determined to be constitutional. If the government itself is permitted to determine the question of the constitutionality of its own acts, those, he said, who are capable of tyranny are capable of perjury to sustain it. And so the logical conclusion here, a free people, or anything even remotely in the range of being somewhere near a land of the free, well, in that situation, you can never, ever, ever allow government to have the final say over itself. He said, if, in other words, the people had reserved to themselves no veto upon the acts of the government, instead of being a mere servant and agent of the people, would be an absolute despot over the people. It would have all power in its own hands because the power to punish carries all other powers with it. And that, in and of itself, would represent unlimited power, total tyranny. He said a power that can of itself, and by its own authority, punish disobedience, can compel obedience and submission, and is above all responsibility for the character of its laws. In short, it is a despotism. So what about all those checks that we learned about in civics class as we were growing up? Well, let's run through some of the big ones. First of all, the oath of office. They all swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, and that should stop them, right? Well, Spooner thought this was absurd, and he considered oaths meaningless in practice because people with power, or people who want to wield all kinds of power to harm other people, to control them, to attack their liberty, to rip them off, to rob them, to kill them, they don't have honor. They don't care. They'll say whatever. And he put it like this: it is of no avail to say, in answer to this view of the case, that in surrendering their liberties into the hands of the government, the people took an oath from the government that it would exercise its power within certain constitutional limits. For when did oaths ever restrain a government that was otherwise unrestrained? And if the government determines the extent of its own powers, it is unrestrained. And he tied that all together. He said, or when did a government fail to determine that all its acts were within the constitutional and authorized limits of its power, if it were permitted to determine that question for itself? Moving on, what about public debate and protests and pressure, speaking out and printing and publishing? Well, that changes things, right? Wrong again. And Spooner said, neither is it of any avail to say that if the government abuse its power and enact unjust and oppressive laws, the government may be changed by the influence of discussion and the exercise of the right of suffrage, which we'll get to in a moment. And here's why. Because for tyrants, words without action, that's just noise. It is meaningless to them. He said discussion can do nothing to prevent the enactment or procure the repeal of unjust laws, unless it be understood that the discussion is to be followed by resistance. It's almost like, well, you can talk about it, but talk means nothing. If talk is followed up with action, then maybe they start listening. He said tyrants care nothing for discussions that are to end only in discussion. And Spooner closed this thought out with maybe the most important takeaway for all of us in modern times. Anything that you do, unless it affects the enforcement of their so-called laws, regulations, rules, orders, and the like, well, it's worthless to tyrants. They don't care about it. It's just noise. Discussions, he said, which do not interfere with the enforcement of their laws are but idle wind to them. And that brings us to the next check on power, the one that most people think is really the only check that we the people have. Vote the bums out. And this is where Spooner twists the knife and explains in detail why it just doesn't work. In fact, it's impossible, at least to start, because it's only every few years, and that can't stop the tyranny that's happening right now. You got to sit around and bear it for 2 or 4 or 6 years or much longer. He said suffrage is equally powerless and unreliable. It can be exercised only periodically. And the tyranny must at least be born until the time for suffrage comes. Now, let's say magically, somehow, the people are able to vote out all the bums, get rid of all the problematic people, and replace them with new ones, even though that never seems to happen. But let's say hypothetically, even in that situation, the new bums come in and they face the same incentives that the previous ones had: corruption, power, and the like. He said, besides, when the suffrage is exercised, it gives no guarantee for the repeal of existing laws that are oppressive, and no security against the enactment of new ones that are equally so. The second body of legislators are liable and likely to be just as tyrannical as the first. And this should be obvious because the same people chose the bad ones to start. Are they suddenly wising up and choosing a bunch of awesome people? Spooner didn't think that would happen. He said, if it be said that the second body may be chosen for their integrity, the answer is that the first were chosen for that very reason and yet proved tyrants. The second, he said, will be exposed to the same temptations as the first and will be just as likely to prove tyrannical. And he went on to totally mock the idea that you can rely on vote the bums out to get a bunch of new people in there that are going to be honest and trustworthy. He said whoever heard that succeeding legislators were, on the whole, more honest than those that preceded them. What is there in the nature of men or things to make them so? If you answered on that second question, absolutely nothing, you passed Lysander Spooner's test for today. And of course, the way that politicians got in power in the first place tells us all we need to know about the success rate of replacing bums or the potential success rate. It's going to be really, really low, if not zero. He said, if it be said that the first body were chosen from motives of injustice, that fact proves that there is a portion of society who desire to establish injustice. And if they were powerful or artful enough to procure the election of their instruments to compose the first legislature, they will be likely to be powerful or artful enough to procure the election of the same or similar instruments to compose the second. Again, if the people are so corrupt and so, well, they're so on board with injustice that they're willing to choose bad people, what suddenly is going to wake them up? Wake up, America, and suddenly just magically choose good people. And even worse, once they are in office, they get away with almost everything. They have almost total immunity all the time. Zero accountability until the next cycle, and then the whole thing is rinse and repeat. He said, but at best, the right of suffrage can be exercised only periodically. And between the periods, the legislators are wholly irresponsible. They're just irresponsible in general. He said, no despot was ever more entirely irresponsible than our Republican legislators during the period for which they are chosen. So people in a free republic, he's saying, these are the most irresponsible despots ever. He said they can neither be removed from their office, nor called to account while in their office, nor punished after they leave their office, be their tyranny what it may. And all we need to do to find proof of this is look all through history. We live under the largest government in the history of the world. It is nowhere remotely close to the Constitution of the Founders, one of few and defined delegated powers to the federal government. And all kinds of stuff, I mean, literally, almost everything is a violation of the oath to the Constitution. Almost everything is a violation of the limits of the Constitution. No one gets punished for doing that. That's because the system here, as Spooner is explaining, really provides no accountability if you are relying on the system to protect you from it. Well, what about the other two branches, the courts, the president? As Spooner put it, the only way to hold these people accountable while they are in office, violating the Constitution, attacking your liberty, is to rely on the corrupt legislators. I mean, if you think about it, this is pretty stupid. Trying to convince a bunch of people with power who are corrupt, who are violating the rules to protect you from a bunch of other people in power who are corrupt and violating the rules is just dumb and dangerous. He said, moreover, the judicial and executive departments of the government are equally irresponsible to the people and are only responsible by impeachment and dependence for their salaries to these irresponsible legislators. So what's left? Well, it's the big one. Alter or abolish, right from the Declaration of Independence. But Spooner here, in practice, he forces us to face the hard truth. Tyrants never recognize the right to alter or abolish when it matters. They're happy to grandstand on it, talk about the beautiful prose when it doesn't matter, but when it comes down to addressing their power, then it's always illegal. The right of revolution, he wrote, which tyrants in mockery accord to mankind, is no legal right under a government. It is only a natural right to overturn a government. The government itself never acknowledges this right. And so what does that mean in practice? That's the issue here. To alter or abolish this right, this natural right to alter or abolish, only works as a check on power if you win. All other times, you're a traitor. And it doesn't matter if you were right or wrong, you are always a traitor if you lose. He said the right, therefore, can be exercised with impunity only when it is exercised victoriously. All unsuccessful attempts at revolution, however justifiable in themselves, are punished as treason if the government be permitted to judge of the treason. And again, this gets down to the core issue. If you put it all together, if you rely on government to limit government, you're going to get unlimited government guaranteed. He said these legislators and this government, so irresponsible while in power, can perpetuate their power at pleasure if they can determine what legislation is authoritative upon the people and can enforce obedience to it. Well, because they can do all kinds of stuff. They can just get away with whatever when you get down to it. He said, for they can not only declare their power perpetual, but they can enforce submission to all legislation that is necessary to secure its perpetuity. And he gave kind of a laundry list of some types of really crazy things that could happen in such a system. And if you're anything like me, at least a few of these sound at least kind of familiar. He said they can, for example, prohibit all discussion of the rightfulness of their authority, forbid the use of the suffrage, prevent the election of any successors, disarm, plunder, imprison, and even kill all who refuse submission. Add a little robbery into the mix, and all those discussions, the votes, protests, oaths, courts, and the rest, that idle wind, well, government will show you what it means to them from the barrel of a gun. Spooner said, if the government can take a man's money without his consent, there is no limit to the additional tyranny it may practice upon him. For with his money, it can hire soldiers to stand over him, keep him in subjection, plunder him at discretion, and kill him if he resists. Truth is not always easy to hear. Truth is not always good news, but truth can heal. Learning it is the first step to getting from where we are today, the largest government in history, to where we want to be, a real land of the free. Get us on the path to liberty. And you're never going to hear this kind of lesson in the government-run and government-approved so-called education system. And that's a huge part of the reason why we work so hard every single day here at the TAC to reach and teach more and more people with these essential principles. And I've got another episode, Spooner, a follow-up episode that I'm planning in the next week or so, Spooner's solution to these problems. Hopefully you'll find that interesting as well. But nothing helps us do this kind of work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing, dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Now, if you already are a member, I'm very grateful for your support. I can't say that enough. Or if you want to make an additional contribution, no pressure. I just want to make sure you already have this information. Or if you just want to make a contribution but not become a member, same link, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Now, there's also a bunch of free and easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word, primarily taking actions on the mainstream platforms, because that triggers their algorithm and tells it to show us to more people. It really does work, so I'm very grateful for the help. Of course, watch time percentage on YouTube is probably one of the biggest ones. So if it's a 20-minute video you watch for 20 minutes, it's 100%. It's pretty good. 40 minutes is 200%, way better. You get the idea. You can also hit the like button, subscribe, get notifications. Comments in the archive is a big one. Sharing links is a big one. Of course, the podcast platforms, leaving reviews and the like. Again, I really appreciate your support, whether it's financial, otherwise, or all the above. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was interesting, maybe a little entertaining here and there, but more important than anything, I hope it made you think and I hope you learned something. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. Have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.